History, as we know it, is written by the victors. But what if I told you that sometimes it's written by the terrified? What if a king was so powerful, so dominant, that his enemies, unable to defeat him on the battlefield, decided to wage a war against his memory? A war fought with ink and parchment, a war of lies that would echo through centuries, shaping everything we thought we knew about him. This is the story of a king whose greatest battle wasn't for land or power, but for his very identity, a battle he lost long after his death. Prepare to question everything, because we're about to uncover the truth behind the king history tried to erase. For centuries, one name has been synonymous with tyranny, cruelty, and villainy. King Richard III of England. We all know the story, or at least we think we do. The hunchbacked monster who murdered his own nephews, the two little princes in the tower, to claw his way to the throne. A caricature of evil so perfect, it was immortalized by Shakespeare himself. This image is so deeply ingrained in our culture that it feels like fact. But what if it's the greatest character assassination in history? What if the story we've been told is a deliberate fabrication, a masterpiece of political propaganda designed by the very people who overthrew him? To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 15th century England, a time of brutal civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. Two powerful families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, were locked in a bloody struggle for the English crown. Richard, born into the House of York, was the youngest brother of King Edward IV. Far from being the twisted, malevolent figure of legend, contemporary accounts describe Richard as a loyal and capable commander. He was his brother's right-hand man, a skilled military leader, and a respected administrator of northern England. He was known for his piety and his sense of justice. So, where did it all go so wrong? The turning point came in 1483. King Edward IV died suddenly, leaving behind two young sons, 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother, Richard. The late king had named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, tasked with governing the kingdom until the young Edward came of age. But here's where the official story starts to get murky. Richard arrived in London to find the court in chaos. The Queen's family, the Woodvilles, were making a power grab, trying to sideline Richard and control the young king for themselves. They were deeply unpopular and seen as ambitious upstarts. Richard, acting swiftly, intercepted the young king and his Woodville entourage, arresting the Queen's brother and son. Was this the act of a power-hungry uncle, or a Lord Protector trying to stabilize a volatile political situation and protect his nephew from a manipulative faction? This is where the story takes its most famous and darkest turn. The two princes were housed in the Tower of London, which at the time was not just a prison, but also a royal residence. And then they vanished. Suddenly, Richard produced evidence. A high-ranking clergyman testified that King Edward IV's marriage to the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was invalid. He claimed Edward had a pre-existing marriage contract with another woman, making his children illegitimate and thus ineligible for the throne. With the princes declared illegitimate, the line of succession fell to the next legitimate heir, Richard himself. He was crowned King Richard III. The convenient disappearance of the princes, followed by Richard taking the crown, has been presented as an open and shut case of murder and usurpation for 500 years. But the evidence is purely circumstantial. There is not a single contemporary piece of proof that Richard ordered their deaths. In fact, their disappearance was just as beneficial, if not more so, to another man. Enter Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the throne with a very weak link to the Lancastrian line. Henry was living in exile in France. He saw the chaos in England as his golden opportunity. The disappearance of the princes was the perfect propaganda tool. He could paint Richard as a monstrous child killer, a tyrant who stole the throne. This narrative rallied support to his cause, uniting disillusioned Yorkists and opportunistic nobles against Richard. Suddenly, Richard wasn't just fighting a political rival. He was fighting a story that portrayed him as the ultimate villain. This narrative was powerful, simple, and horrifying. And it worked. In 1485, just 2 years into Richard's reign, Henry Tudor invaded England. The two forces met at the Battle of Bosworth Field. In a crucial moment, one of Richard's key allies, Lord Stanley, betrayed him, switching sides in the middle of the battle. Despite this, Richard didn't flee. He spotted Henry Tudor's banner across the field and led a desperate, heroic charge directly at his rival, attempting to end the war with a single blow. He fought bravely, cutting down Henry's standard-bearer, but was ultimately surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. With Richard dead, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. Now, he had a major problem. He had taken the throne by force. His own claim to it was incredibly flimsy. To secure his rule and that of his descendants, he needed to legitimize his usurpation. And the best way to do that was to utterly destroy the reputation of the man he had overthrown. The Tudor propaganda machine went into overdrive. Henry commissioned historians like Polydore Virgil and Thomas More to write the official history of Richard's reign. They systematically gathered every rumor, every piece of gossip, and every accusation, and wove them into a seamless narrative of pure evil. They claimed Richard was physically deformed from birth, a sign of his twisted soul, a common medieval trope. They wrote as fact that he personally murdered his nephews in cold blood. Every action Richard took as Lord Protector and King was reframed as part of a long premeditated plan to seize power. They controlled the press. They controlled the story. Anyone who had supported Richard was now a traitor, their voices silenced. Any documents that portrayed Richard in a positive light mysteriously vanished. The Tudors weren't just rewriting history. They were erasing it. This campaign of defamation was so successful that it culminated decades later in the ultimate piece of propaganda, William Shakespeare's play, Richard III. Writing under the reign of Henry VII's granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth I, Shakespeare had no choice but to toe the party line. He took the Tudor version of Richard and turned him into one of literature's greatest villains, a cunning, charismatic, and utterly depraved monster who famously declares, "I am determined to prove a villain." Shakespeare's play was a blockbuster hit. It cemented the monstrous image of Richard in the public imagination so powerfully that it has endured for over 400 years. The play was fiction, a piece of entertainment based on politically motivated lies, but it became accepted as historical fact. The propaganda had won. For centuries, this was the undisputed story. But in recent decades, historians have started to look again. They began questioning the Tudor sources, realizing they were written with a clear political agenda. They discovered pre-Tudor accounts that described Richard as a good ruler. Then, in 2012, an incredible discovery was made. Archaeologists found a skeleton under a parking lot in Leicester, the site of the old Greyfriars Church, where Richard was hastily buried after his death. DNA testing confirmed it. They had found the lost king. The skeleton revealed something fascinating. He did have scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but he was not the hunchbacked toad of Tudor legend. He would have had one shoulder slightly higher than the other, something barely noticeable and clothed. The severe physical deformities were a lie. His battle wounds showed he died fighting, consistent with the accounts of his final brave charge. The king himself had returned from the grave to challenge the lies told about him. So, if Richard didn't kill the princes, who did? While we may never know for certain, many modern historians point the finger at two other key suspects. The first is Henry Tudor himself. The princes, even if declared illegitimate, were still a threat to his reign. As long as they were alive, they could be used as figureheads for a Yorkist rebellion. Their deaths would have secured his throne far more effectively than they secured Richard's. The other prime suspect is the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's former ally, who later rebelled against him. Some theories suggest Buckingham killed the boys on his own initiative, hoping to frame Richard and seize power for himself. The key takeaway is this: the case against Richard is incredibly weak, built on the propaganda of his enemies. We have been convicting a man based on the testimony of the person who benefited most from his death. The story of Richard III is a chilling reminder of how easily history can be manipulated. It shows that the pen can indeed be mightier than the sword, and that a lie, if told loud enough and long enough, can become the truth. Richard wasn't a saint. He was a 15th century nobleman, ambitious and ruthless like all the rest. But he was almost certainly not the monster Shakespeare and the Tudors made him out to be. He was a king so feared by his enemies that they had to kill him twice, once on the battlefield and a second time on the pages of history. The real tragedy is that for 500 years, the second death was the one that stuck. It's time we gave him a fair trial. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries. If you enjoy questioning the official story and uncovering the truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. What do you think? Was Richard framed? Let me know your theories in the comments below. See you next time.